In 1957, the Italian Mafia unwittingly stepped into the spotlight, marking an inadvertent turning point that would ultimately lead to the downfall of organized crime. Since the 1930s, this shadowy syndicate had wielded significant influence over American affairs, particularly Italian organized crime, which had entrenched itself in the nation's fabric since the early 1900s. Operating within a powerful network of secrecy and allegiance, these figures were formidable players in the world of organized crime. Their reach extended deep into governmental structures, having even compromised the highest echelons of law enforcement. The head of the FBI adamantly denied the existence of a mafia presence on American soil, a testament to the extent of their influence. Moreover, they had infiltrated the Central Intelligence Agency, playing a clandestine role in pivotal events, such as the rise of communism in Cuba under Castro. Despite collaborating with the CIA in 1959 to oust Castro from power, they found themselves locked in a bitter struggle with the Washington establishment. This conflict escalated with the onset of various committee hearings probing organized crime. Concurrently, efforts were underway to establish new governmental bodies geared towards confronting and dismantling the Mafia's grip on American society. Thus, the unintended exposure of the Italian Mafia in 1957 set into motion a sequence of events that would ultimately challenge their hegemony and pave the way for their eventual downfall. Despite the Italian Mafia's profound influence, many Americans remained largely unaware of the true extent of its power and reach. This criminal syndicate stood as one of the world's most formidable and affluent, boasting a level of influence that permeated various sectors of society. The article I am about to present, dating back to 1960, only scratches the surface of the intricate history of the Italian Mafia. Nevertheless, it represents the initial fissures that began to emerge, hinting at the vulnerability beneath the syndicate's facade. In the magazine, prominent names like Russell Bufalino and Vito Genovese, alongside other influential crime families such as the Bufalino crime family, took center stage. The Bufalino clan, renowned for its secrecy, found itself thrust into the public eye, much to Russell Bufalino's dismay. The article revealed government initiatives aimed at creating new agencies and gathering intelligence to confront the Italian organized crime structure head-on. For Russell Bufalino, the prospect of this formidable opposition posed a direct threat to his operations, a reality he sought to forestall. This revelation unfolded against the backdrop of the July 1960 period, coinciding with organized crime's backing of the Kennedy administration. This alignment of interests underscored the complex interplay between underworld figures and political forces, setting the stage for a showdown between the entrenched powers and the emerging governmental apparatus aimed at dismantling them. Giancana forged significant alliances within Hollywood and the Kennedy family, reaching out to figures like Bufalino to assure him that supporting the Kennedy ticket was in the best interest of thwarting any threats to the Italian organized crime structure. Articles like the one in question began to instill fear within the Mafia, signaling the onset of a brewing war against organized crime, narco-traffickers, and those engaged in illicit activities. Sensing the urgency, the Mafia mobilized on an unprecedented scale, with New Jersey, Florida, Miami, New York, and Louisiana crime families collaborating to alter the tide turning against them. During this pivotal moment, the mobsters aimed to reap the rewards of their hard-earned riches. Their intent was to sit back, delegate responsibilities, and enjoy their success. However, an unforeseen war emerged, pitting the Mafia against not only the American press, but also the government, with suspicions of collusion between the CIA and organized crime. At the time, the information presented in newspapers was dismissed by figures like Hoover as speculation, laughed off by the FBI. 3 years later, Joe Valachi went on record confirming the suspicions that an Italian power structure was influencing American politics, appointing politicians, senators, and judges. Valachi, unaware of the changing dynamics within the Mafia, believed his revelations would seal his doom. The Mafia's concern was not focused on Apalachin. Instead, they sought to counter the growing influence of the Kennedy administration. Within weeks of this brewing conflict, John F. Kennedy was tragically assassinated in Dallas. Carlos Marcello, a powerful force in Louisiana, was linked to the assassination, a topic to be explored in future discussions. My research draws from various sources, including books by esteemed authors from the 70s, 60s and 80s, Time and Look magazine articles, and extensive research to provide a comprehensive understanding of organized crime and its evolution. The 60s are often referred to as the platinum years of organized crime, marked by intense conflicts with the establishment, battles against the Kennedy administration, the loss of Cuba, and numerous deportations and arrests. However, by the 70s, the Mafia remained firmly in control, exerting influence over America's rackets and industries. This historical narrative aims to immerse you in the experiences of those who first encountered these articles, giving you insight into the perspectives of mob bosses grappling with unfolding events. Understanding their trust in the Kennedy administration provides context, akin to Charlie Luciano's trust in FDR to alleviate the pressures of Judge Seabury. As bonds were made, history unfolded, and the article presented here captures a moment in time that shaped the intricate web of organized crime in the United States. Modern police forces have marvelous scientific equipment for solving crimes, but no device can match the efficiency of a conscientious police officer like Sergeant Edgar Croswell, a tall, intense New York State trooper with an ulcer aggravated by his hatred of hoodlums. Croswell was making a routine investigation of a bad check that had been cashed at a rural motel on his beat when, on the tranquil afternoon of November 13, 1957, he heard reservations were being placed for 6 anonymous guests. Alerted by the rather unusual, furtive way in which the reservations were being made, Croswell had a hunch that something ominous was in the offing. Something was. His hunch enabled Croswell to unmask the country's most powerful and elusive criminal syndicate in actual operation. Croswell exposed what has been called the best demonstration of organized crime in action in the history of criminology. This was the fantastic Mafia convention at Apalachin, New York. More than 75 members of the cabal that controls organized crime in America assembled from 15 states and Cuba for top-level policy decisions in the palatial home of Joe Barbara, a suspect in 2 murders during Prohibition. Never before had there been such a concentration of jailbirds, murderers free on technicalities, and big wheels in gambling and dope rackets. The turnout in the obscure village reflected the crises agitating the underworld. Reports from federal undercover agents agreed the chief emergency centered around the Mafia's oldest stock in trade, the traffic in dope. In 1956, Congress passed the Narcotic Control Act, which carried drastic penalties up to 20 years imprisonment for a first conviction for dope peddling. SIF sentences and losses of valuable consignments of junk had increased sharply, with resultant cuts in profits. The Mafia's Supreme Council had decided to get out of dope and focus on far more lucrative and safer activities in gambling and industrial racketeering. Trouble was anticipated, though, from underlings who were not cut in on gambling, the Mafia's meal ticket. The session had been called to threaten the lower echelon with severe reprisals for failure to comply with the ban on dope. The order from the big brass was widely ignored subsequently. According to the Bureau of Narcotics, the Mafia still distributes 95% of the dope sold illegally in the United States. An impending war for gambling territorial rights was another urgent reason for the Apalachin meeting. Just 3 weeks earlier, the syndicate had been rocked by the killing of Albert Anastasia, boss of the New York waterfront and the former executioner of Murder Incorporated, the Mafia's hatchet squad said to have done away with 63 victims in the 30s. The killing of a high-ranking Mafia Don follows a ritual as formal as a military court-martial. The killing of a high-ranking Mafia Don follows a ritual as formal as a military court-martial. The victim is dispatched under circumstances designed for maximum publicity to warn others who might have funny ideas about getting out of line. Anastasia was killed by two masked gunmen in the crowded barbershop of a New York hotel at 9:30 in the morning. In January 1958, John T. Cusack, a district supervisor of the Federal Narcotics Bureau, testified before a New York State Legislative Committee investigating the Apalachin meeting that there was reason to believe Anastasia's death was caused by a dispute over gambling concessions in an establishment operated by Santo Traficante Jr. in Havana. In investigating the Anastasia murder, New York police learned that two Cuban desperados, fitting the descriptions of the killers, had flown to New York 3 days before the shooting. 5 hours after the job was pulled, one of them left Idlewild Airport on a plane bound for Havana. Santo Traficante Jr. is believed to have been in New York at the time of the killing and was among those at the Apalachin meeting. It seemed evident that Anastasia's death was sanctioned by a faction in the Supreme Council, for it had all the earmarks of an enforcement murder. The record rally at Apalachin also was an endorsement of gambling overlord Vito Genovese's campaign to supersede Frank Costello in the #1 spot. Costello had narrowly missed death the previous May when a gangland executioner fired at him directly. It was an open secret that the younger element wanted to unload Costello because his prosecutions by immigration and income tax authorities were attracting too much attention to the organization. The gangsters were discussing their monstrous business when they were thrown into a panic by Sergeant Croswell, who was seen taking down the licenses of the cars parked outside Barbara's house. Soon after, Croswell discovered the rendezvous with methodical police work, which will be described presently. The mafiosi tried to flee in cars or on foot through the surrounding woods. Croswell and his fellow troopers rounded up about 50 of the 63 delegates who were positively identified later as having attended the meeting. The 63 men had a combined total of 151 previous arrests and 75 convictions. When the thugs were asked to explain their presence at Barbara's place, they brazenly told variations on the same story. They had heard that their dear old chum Joe was recuperating from an operation and decided independently to pay him a visit. Imagine their astonishment to find that solicitous friends from as far away as California, Texas, and Florida had been seized by the identical idea during the middle of the week. After the interrogation, Croswell concluded he did not have sufficient evidence to hold the men for a specific offense. Although the Hoods got off the hook temporarily, the uproar aroused by the episode led to the most significant action ever taken by the government in the fight against organized crime. The meeting triggered the first coordinated effort to crack the Mafia and affiliated syndicates, whose illicit revenue is estimated at $20 billion a year by Attorney General William P. Rogers. 5 months after Apalachin, the Department of Justice created the Special Group on Organized Crime, a task force with unprecedented jurisdiction to prosecute federal offenses anywhere in the country. The big surprise or shock in the announcement of the Special Group's formation on April 10, 1958, was my appointment to head the unit. As several commentators observed, I ranked high among the most improbable candidates in America for the role of racket buster. Phillips Andover Academy, Yale, and Harvard Law School were an incongruous background for grappling with the Mafia and the vicious guerrillas on the periphery of the syndicates. After graduating from Harvard in 1948, my principal field was civil litigation involving large corporations, a branch of the law as far removed from murder, dope, and gambling as Alaska from Zanzibar. On the advice of old Washington hands, I declined to hold a press conference or have my picture taken after my appointment. It would have been silly to issue bold pronouncements about my mission when nobody knew what I was supposed to do. Besides, a big splash by me, an unknown 34-year-old lawyer, would have antagonized many men who have devoted their careers to fighting crime. I managed to duck reporters and photographers, but the New York Herald Tribune got a copy of my wedding picture from my father-in-law and ran it on page 1. I looked like a wide-eyed callow youth about to be fed to the vultures for breakfast. That's exactly how I felt. Oddly enough, my early experience in corporate matters was ideal training, in a technical sense, for prosecuting the Mafia. 2 complicated cases were especially helpful in learning to assemble the massive evidence the special group later marshaled against gangsters. I was on the staff representing Harry Ferguson, an English tractor manufacturer who sued the Ford Motor Company for $320 million on patent infringements and antitrust violations. Ford settled for $9,250,000 and major patent rights midway through the trial in 1952. At that point, the printed record of the case ran 9,000 pages, and we had more than 1 million exhibits on microfilm. The other backbreaker was a suit for $66 million brought by the government in 1957 against 6 companies accused of overcharging European customers for oil purchased under the Marshall Plan. I helped to defend Standard Oil of California. All the charges were dismissed. My first exposure to the attitude of the professional criminal came in 1954, a year after I was appointed Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. A dope peddler with several previous convictions was brought into my office. With all the crusading zeal I could command, I urged him to cooperate in telling us the source of his supply. The man looked at me contemptuously. "You were lucky enough to have a father who put you through college," he said curtly. "My business is on the other side." Asking him to violate the Underworld's code was as reprehensible to him as an offer of a bribe would have been to me. It offended his sense of ethics. I received my postgraduate education in organized crime in 1955 when I prosecuted William Giglio and Frank Livorsi for cheating the government of $850,000 in taxes for 1946. They had gone into partnership with a candy manufacturer during the war, then forced him out with threats of violence and grossed $6 million in 18 months by getting 14 million pounds of sugar illegally. Giglio, the brain of the outfit, was not a mafia man, but Livorsi, the muscle, was believed to have been. He had a record of 20 arrests, 2 for homicide. Livorsi was in the deal strictly as watchdog for the Mafia, the comptroller of the company. Giglio consulted constantly with Frank Costello. Big John Ormento, a leading dope supplier in New York, was on the payroll with a number of Mafia nobles. Nailing the organization's front men for concealing their assets by shifting funds among 11 dummy corporations entailed stupefying digging through a maze of phony books. The case was broken when the firm's accountant was persuaded by his son, a reputable lawyer, to testify for the government. Giglio and Livorsi were sent to prison for 15 years, the stiffest sentences ever handed down for tax evasion. 3 years after the trial, a startling phone call from Washington uprooted me from a peaceful private law practice. Federal Judge Lawrence E. Walsh, who presided at the Giglio-Livorsi case, had been appointed Deputy Attorney General and recommended me to spearhead the Justice Department's drive against criminal syndicates. Specifically, that meant tangling with the world's oldest continuous criminal conspiracy. One legend traces the Mafia's origin back to 1282, but most chroniclers place more credence in accounts relating its rise to the upheaval that followed Napoleon's invasion of Sicily in 1799. Wealthy landowners hired local mafiosi, tough guys in the Sicilian dialect, to safeguard their property from marauders. The goons turned on their employers and extracted tributes for protecting them, a technique later refined in American labor disputes. Then they combined to terrorize the peasants and collect kickbacks on crops. The Mafia gained a stranglehold on the social and economic life of Sicily. Its power has never been broken in some areas. Some people insist it is incorrect to pin the Mafia label on American gangs because not all members are native-born Sicilians, nor are they put through a blood-right initiation ceremony. It seems to me this is an absurd quibble. I call the organization the Mafia because that is the term used by police officials and undercover agents who contend with it. Whether it is known as the Mafia, the Black Hand, or anything else is immaterial. The threat is precisely the same. Conclusive proof of the Mafia's network and its murderous methods was found soon after the special group was activated. A joint investigation was set up with the Bureau of Narcotics and the Customs Service to uncover links between Sicilian and American mafiosi. On October 9, 1958, a rare prize was obtained in New York when a courier arrived from Italy with a letter, revealed here for the first time by Narcotics Commissioner Harry J. Anslinger. The document's insight to the utter amorality of the Mafia gives it the morbid fascination of watching a basket of snakes. The letter was from Niccolo Gentile, a former top dog in the dope racket. Gentile, arrested in New York, jumped $50,000 bail and fled to Sicily in 1937 with a card index of 88 names and addresses that was a who's who of narcotics traffickers in America. The 3-page letter was addressed to one Cunigliedu, a code name meaning little rabbit in the Sicilian dialect. Gentile complained that he had not received adequate compensation for his years of devoted service to the combination. He appealed to Cunigliedu for financial help. "Our acquaintance amounts to about 40 years now," Gentile wrote. "You followed me in all things and for all things. The road you have taken, by virtue of your intelligence, has brought you to a superior social level, so that today you are a leader and well regarded. Truly, it is a merit to your person, something to be appreciated, and for this I send you my deepest and sincerest congratulations." The letter was studded with codenames and cryptic references to power struggles in the Swiss army that held the keys to many unsolved Mafia murders. Gentile accused a Don Mafalano of a double cross in reducing his cut from 40 to 5% in an affair, a dope concession, in New Orleans and Texas. He blamed his difficulties on a Mr. Napolitano, who had muscled him out of a gambling concession and forced him to take a mediocre system, a poor base of operations in New York's Greenwich Village. "During my lifetime I'll have made some errors," Gentile admitted piously, "but as Jesus said, 'Let him who is without sin cast the first stone.'" He ended with a plea for help in repaying a loan of 2 million lire to the Bank of Sicily. "I must get rid of this debt in order to breathe and get my last daughter a job in the bank. She cannot get this position unless I pay off the debt. This really hurts my conscience, so that before I leave this life, Elle wants to get my daughter a job." The value of the letter was in identifying the code names, of course. The Bureau of Narcotics sent it to Rome, where undercover agents Andrew Turtaglino and Frederick Cornetta were stationed with the approval of Italian authorities and instructed them to get the desired information from Gentile. The agents devised a gambit older than E. Phillips Oppenheim's Cloak and Dagger novels to trap Gentile. Cornetta, posing as an emissary from Cunigliedu, made an appointment with Gentile. When they met, Cornetta pulled out $1/2 of a dollar bill and asked Gentile to produce the missing piece mailed from America by Cunigliedu to make sure everything was on the level. Gentile said Cunigliedu's letter had not yet arrived, but in desperation, Gentile offered to prove he had sent the original letter by identifying the code names. Cunigliedu was Joe Biondo, a labor racketeer in the New York garment district who since has disappeared. Don Mafalano, the head of the dope ring, was Vincent Mangano, also a fugitive. Mr. Napolitano, the overlord of gambling, was Vito Genovese. At later meetings, 73-year-old Gentile, eager to impress his former prestige on the agents he believed to be mafiosi, bragged about past exploits. He led to victory over the Calabrese Southern Italians in gang wars for control of the Pittsburgh rackets during the 30s. He sat on the Mafia Council that passed the death sentence on Salvatore Maranzano, who led a revolt against the leaders in 1931. He said Genovese had played him of against Mangano in the hope that both of them would be killed, giving Genovese clear title to gambling in New York. Gentile proudly related that he had assisted Lucky Luciano when the boss of the Mafia's dope ring in Europe was turned back by Cuba in an abortive attempt to return to the United States, from which he was deported in 1946. The agents asked the old man whether he could help them buy a large quantity of heroin. He assured them he could set up the deal with Pietro Davi, the biggest smuggler in Italy, whose daughter was marrying his son in 2 months. When the agents revealed their identities to Gentile, he was so terrified he agreed to cooperate with the Bureau of Narcotics and the Italian police on the promise that the report of the incident would remain in confidential files. He immediately disappeared to escape the vengeance of the Mafia, or because it caught up with him. I realize the public finds it difficult to believe there is a nationwide criminal confederation directed by the Mafia. Like too many other people, I was a skeptic until I looked behind the woodwork and found the vermin undermining the structure of our society. But I'm getting ahead of my story. After my appointment to head the special group, Judge Walsh and I discussed procedures and agreed on 3 basic principles. 1. To coordinate all information in government files pertaining to organized crime. 2. To avoid duplicating the work of other agencies. 3. To try to devise a new legal technique for prosecuting the syndicates. Both of us decided the coordination of detailed reports on notorious criminals was the first essential step. I naively assumed it was simply a matter of requesting dossiers, pinpointing the gangsters active in various rackets, then putting together the links that connected local mobs in national syndicates. I quickly received a rude jolt. There was no sole source where the special group or any other government agency could get a fairly comprehensive analysis of current criminals. No bureau had authoritative information on syndicate leaders. Sworn statements to investigators and grand juries were scattered among 91 United States district attorneys and thousands of local prosecutors. The statements never had been assembled for cross-checking and reference. The files available to us at the outset held little more than past arrests and convictions. They did not trace Vito Genovese's sources of income, which was rumored to be $20,000 a week. 13 of the 63 Apalachin delegates had no police records. The files contained no leads to such shadowy figures. The inadequacy of the material stemmed from the splintered nature of American law enforcement, a handicap that continues to plague police officials. The FBI's jurisdiction, for example, is restricted to 45 statutes. It does not have authority to investigate gambling, bootlegging, smuggling, and a score of other rackets. The special group effected an innovation that was long overdue by collating information from 51 federal and 85 state and local agencies. The clinching demonstration of what could be accomplished with even fair liaison was the development of the Apalachin case. At first, we had absolutely no intention of pursuing the Mafia meeting. The FBI, a New York State Commission, and a dozen other units had dissected the affair exhaustively. Although numerous charges had been brought against individuals, no agency had been able to find grounds for indicting the delegates as a group. It seemed futile for our small staff to explore the matter further. Despite our sweeping authority to prosecute all federal crimes, we were hindered badly in one critical area. Our skimpy budget of $200,000 a year did not provide for investigators to dig up new leads on the syndicate leaders who were our targets. We had to depend entirely on sketchy second-hand reports from other agencies. 19 lawyers were appointed to our 5 regional offices, but the active force averaged 11 men. Few of us were specialists in criminal law. There were serious gaps in the intelligence given to us. Yet the pattern of organized crime began to emerge when unrelated pieces of information were put together like a jigsaw puzzle. No brilliant deduction was required to perceive the clear outline of a valid charge against the Mafia. The case was sitting there waiting to be prosecuted. My purpose in collaborating on these articles is to urge plead for the creation of a permanent federal prosecuting team to expedite closer cooperation among law enforcement agencies than exists now. Most units are trying to do a competent job, but their effectiveness is blunted by restraints on exchanges of information that are vital for sustained attacks on the underworld. The structure and function of syndicates like the Mafia differ so completely from ordinary gangs that new countermeasures must be adopted to combat them. Organized crime today is much more sophisticated than it was years ago. During the Prohibition era, bootlegging mobs waged bloody wars for control of territories. In the 30s, strong-arm methods were the persuaders, when the hoods turned to extortion on both sides of the fence in labor conflicts. Syndicates now avoid the publicity that incites public anger and sometimes action. Although the threat always is there, they commit new crimes of violence except for internal disciplinary punishment. The upper echelon does not engage actively in the execution of crimes. It directs operations several levels above the riffraff and avoids prosecution by staying outside the jurisdiction of local laws. Another refinement cultivated in recent years is diverting suspicion by hiding behind respectable facades. Most of the Mafia delegates caught at Apalachin by Sergeant Croswell were substantial businessmen. John Montana, who owned a fleet of taxicabs in Buffalo, New York, had achieved such eminence that he was a member of the city council and had been chosen the city's Man of the Year in 1956. Joe Profazzi, the olive oil king of America, admired for his philanthropy in Brooklyn, sat on the Mafia's Supreme Council for 30 years. Russell Bufalino was a prosperous dress manufacturer in Pittston, Pennsylvania. Tony Magadino was a sedate undertaker in Niagara Falls. Paul Castellano owned a chain of butcher shops in New York. The primary objective of a criminal syndicate is to enforce a code of conduct that protects the organization from prosecution. One method of insurance is to make victims participants in the rackets that bleed them white. A horse player who bets $2 with a bookie, a dope addict who buys a fix, or a businessman who enters into an agreement that gives him an unfair advantage over competitors is guilty of a criminal violation. He cannot appeal for legal relief without implicating himself when the syndicate turns the heat on him. This situation throws a monkey wrench into the machinery of law enforcement. Ordinarily, the police begin to look for a culprit after they have something specific to go on. A formal complaint, a victim of violence or an overt act such as a robbery. In the absence of an apparent crime, the process is reversed. A hidden offence must be found before the culprit can be tracked down. As a result, organized crime acquires another layer of protective coloration. Since the public does not see the syndicate's illicit activities, it is not particularly disturbed by them, except in the case of the dope traffic. The Mafia's first commandment is the omertà, or code of silence, which carries the death penalty for those who violate it. Omertà is derived from omu, the Sicilian word for man. By extension, refusal to divulge any information relating to crimes, regardless of the consequences, is the highest manly virtue. George Gaffelny, chief of the Bureau of Narcotics Office in New York, who knows as much about the Mafia as any other non-member, insists that the omertà never has been broken knowingly and that a disciplinary murder never has been solved. According to Lieutenant John J. Minahan of the New York Police Department, 28 unsolved Mafia murders have been committed in the metropolitan area since 1951. A rigid system of rewards and punishments sustains the omertà. If an obscure dope peddler or a petty bookie goes to jail complying with the code of silence, his family is supported in better style than when he was free. His parole is facilitated by placing him with a respectable firm. After his release from prison, he was given a better spot in the organization than he held before his conviction. The blind obedience the Mafia demands was impressed on the special group with a sickening impact shortly after we launched active operations. Despite the difficulty of obtaining even incomplete reports from other agencies, we gradually identified 386 top racketeers who were linked to various syndicates. The deeper we probed, the more persistently we found definite traces of Mafia influence in the underworld. In an effort to organization's setup, we decided to concentrate on the button men, or district supervisors of dope, just below the dons. The board of directors penetrate the Mafia's chain of command. Narcotics agent Dugan spotted several button men who were disregarding the ban on dope issued at Apalachin. One rebel was Joe DeMarco, a dealer in Harlem. Agent Albert Garafola posed as the former college roommate of a Mafia leader's son and played the role so convincingly that DeMarco sold him a kilogram of pure heroin. DeMarco predicted his own murder when he was released on bail after his arrest on October 15, 1958. His body was found on November 22, 1958. He had been bludgeoned twice, shot twice in the head, and stabbed 42 times with an ice pick. A more effective legal approach for attacking the Mafia hierarchy was developed by tedious staff work. I was fortunate to get 4 former assistant United States attorneys who made substantial financial sacrifices to head our regional offices. William Esbitt, a brigadier general in the Army Reserve, headed operations in New York. Richard B. Ogilvy, a member of the Chicago Crime Commission, took charge in that city. Lloyd F. Dunn, former chief federal criminal prosecutor in Southern California, directed the Los Angeles branch, and Joseph P. Manners was the top man in Miami. Despite our reluctance to rehash the Apalachin meeting, all clues pointed to it as the key that would open a lot of doors to noxious cellars. The case we eventually evolved was purely the product of evidence obtained from 30 sources. After Alert Sergeant Croswell's examination at Apalachin, the Hoods had been interrogated by federal agents and police in their own localities. All stories about paying a social visit to Barbara impulsively followed such a similar pattern that the phony character of the script was obvious. We had 145 statements these men had made pertaining to the meeting, and the longer we studied them, the more convinced we were that only one inference could be drawn from the lies. The Hoods were protecting each other to cover up the illicit business that had brought them to Apalachin. Further, the panic that had impelled mature men, many of them prominent in civic affairs, to flee into the woods on a raw autumn day, indicated that something sinister must have been going on in Barbara's house if they resorted to such extreme measures to escape detection. The Omerta ruled out the possibility of proving the illegal purpose of the meeting by the direct testimony of witnesses, but the 63 delegates who were identified provided us with a more serious charge: conspiracy to obstruct justice. The Mafia leaders hanged themselves in a noose carefully knotted by Sergeant Croswell, a backwoods police officer making his appointed rounds with a sensitive nose for fishy odors cultivated by years of experience. Croswell had just finished his inquiry about the bad check that had been cashed at the Parkway Motel in Apalachin when Joe Barbara Jr. entered and reserved 3 double rooms for men who were coming, he said, to a sales meeting at his father's bottling plant. 2 things struck Croswell as rather odd. He generally knew what was happening in the small community, but that was the first time he had heard of the meeting. Then it was strange that young Barbara took the keys to the rooms with him. Any trivial incident involving Joe Barbara Sr. was calculated to arouse Croswell's professional curiosity. He had first encountered Barbara in 1944 when he caught one of Barbara's employees stealing 10 gallons of gas from a company truck. Croswell arrested the man and asked Barbara to come to the state trooper station to make a formal charge. Upon his arrival, Barbara demanded the employee's release. When he was reminded that gas was rationed, he brusquely advised Croswell to mind his own business. Croswell subsequently had reason to wonder about Barbara's connection when he learned that the former murder suspect had a liquor distributor's license and a permit to carry a gun in spite of his police record. Although Croswell had nearly finished his tour of duty on the afternoon of November 13, 1957, he decided to look into the sales meeting young Barbara had mentioned. He drove to the bottling plant with Trooper Vincent Vasisco and observed no unusual activity. They rode by Barbara's estate on the outskirts of the village and saw 4 cars in the driveway. Croswell methodically took the license numbers and, on a hunch called Arthur Rustin and Kenneth Brown, United States Treasury agents attached to the alcohol tax unit in Binghamton, to help him on some legal work. Croswell continued his investigation until 2 in the morning, but there was nothing to confirm his nagging suspicion that something was about to pop. When Croswell went on duty the following morning, his policeman's instincts were still working overtime. His next step helped to clinch the case. He examined the contents of all the wastebaskets the maids at the Parkway Motel had just emptied. In the litter of trash, he found a torn receipt from the Lexington Hotel in New York for a room occupied earlier in the week by James LaDuca. The receipt had no significance at the time, but Croswell saved it. He and the Treasury agents then drove to Barbara's home and were overwhelmed, as he later testified, by the spectacle they saw. At least 30 flashy cars, most in the latest models, were parked in the driveway and the adjacent fields. The officers were noting the licenses when some of Barbara's guests saw them from the terrace and ran excitedly into the house. Croswell and the T-men went down the road and parked out of sight at the junction of the main highway. The sergeant flashed a radio call for reinforcements and awaited developments. It was then 12:40 in the afternoon. The government's charge of conspiracy hinged on the chain of events that broke out 40 minutes later. The end. The follow-up to this magazine promises to be equally captivating, offering further insights into the rise of organized crime during the pivotal 60s. This era marked a turning point, as evidenced by the inauguration of John F. Kennedy in January 1961. Figures like Robert F. Kennedy, undoubtedly influenced by articles such as the one discussed, swiftly moved to address the issue of organized crime. Within months of assuming office, President Kennedy appointed his brother Robert as the Attorney General, signaling a renewed focus on combating organized crime. Robert wasted no time in taking action, beginning with the deportation of Louisiana mob boss Carlos Marcello. Here is an article that came out on Wednesday, 5th, 1961, straight after the deportation of Carlos Marcello, written in the Times. Carlos Marcello, shown here before the Senate Rackets Committee in 1959, was deported yesterday in a surprise move by immigration agents who hustled him aboard a Guatemala-bound airplane at Moisant International Airport in New Orleans. Deportation action, based on his conviction as a trafficker in marijuana, was started in 1953. Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans Underworld leader deported from the United States today, arrived here by air tonight and promptly disappeared mysteriously with a high-ranking Guatemalan Air Force officer. Angered immigration authorities said Marcello is subject to arrest and, perhaps, deportation from Guatemala. The 51-year-old Marcello, who finally lost a 9-year battle to escape U.S. deportation, eluded the immigration officers waiting for him here at the civil airport when his U.S. Border Patrol plane landed instead at the adjoining military airport. He left the military airport with Colonel Antonio Batres, second in command of the Guatemalan Air Force. Ramon Alvarado of the Immigration Office said he had been unable to locate the deportee, who has been labeled by U.S. Senra Estes Kefauver of the former Senate Crime Commission as the #1 U.S. law violator. "We are looking for him," said Alvarado. "We have checked all hotels, and he isn't there." The Air Force declined to comment. Alvarado said he could not explain why the plane landed at the military airport instead of the civilian airport, where about 30 persons, including newsmen and immigration officials, were waiting when Marcello arrived at 6:40 in the afternoon. Newsmen could see the plane land, but could not enter the military airport because it is restricted. Although U.S. immigration authorities had said the Guatemalan government was willing to accept a record showing Marcello was a native of this country, Alvarado seemed unsatisfied on that point. "If he is a Guatemalan, we are going to arrest him, and if he isn't, we are going to deport him," the immigration officer said. Marcello was put on the deportation plane without advance warning when he showed up at the New Orleans Immigration Office on his regular date for reporting to authorities. Marcello carried no luggage. He made no protest, no comment, a sharp contrast to the bitter legal fight he waged to prevent deportation. But his attorney, Jack Wasserman, protested bitterly in Washington. Wasserman called the government's action barbarous and completely illegal, and said he plans to file papers in court tomorrow to try to get Marcello back into the United States. He declared that the government procedure amounted to kidnapping. Marcello reported to the immigration office as he was supposed to do, was handcuffed and hustled to a plane, Wasserman said. He wasn't allowed to say goodbye to his wife and family, or even pack a toothbrush. This, he said, is not in keeping with the way the United States should act. Wasserman said that in all previous actions, the government contended that Marcello was born in Tunis, but now they're claiming he was born in Guatemala. Wasserman said papers he would file tomorrow would contend that the government acted illegally and that the court should restore the status quo. Meanwhile, it was learned that the fast-moving deportation of Marcello was carried out on the instruction of Immigration Commissioner Joseph M. Swing, who advised Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy about the matter after it had been carried out. C. W. Johnson, agent in charge of the New Orleans Immigration and Naturalization Service, said today was the regular 3-month reporting date for Marcello, whose origins are somewhat clouded, but with a record that he was born in Guatemala. Johnson said, as far as the federal government was concerned, Marcello had not been alerted that he was to be deported today. But he could have figured it out for himself, Johnson said. After all, this thing has been going on for 9 years, and there is no impending litigation in the courts that would prevent his deportation. Once such legal barriers were removed, we were then obligated to deport him. The deportation, Johnson said, was based on a narcotics violation and Marcello's failure to become a citizen, although he had lived in the United States since he was a child. When called before the Senate Rackets Committee in 1959, Marcello invoked the Fifth Amendment 35 times to avoid answering questions concerning his occupation, sources of income, and association with local police officials. He had invoked the Fifth Amendment in much the same fashion before the old Senate Crime Commission, headed by Senator Estes Kefauver, D10, at hearings in New Orleans in 1950. The country's #1 law violator is the tag Kefauver hung on Marcello. The man who tried to pry the answers from Marcello 2 years ago was Rackets Committee Counsel Robert F. Kennedy, now the Attorney General of the United States. Marcello allegedly had police protection in Jefferson Parish, which adjoins New Orleans, with his operations extending into other areas of Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and Arkansas. The Guatemalan government, the Immigration Service said, was willing to accept a record showing Marcello was born there. Concerning Marcello's real place of birth, the Immigration Service related these circumstances. Marcello has been listed by the service as an Italian national on the basis of a baptismal record of Sainte Croix Church in Carthage, North Africa, showing the baptism on March 28, 1910, of one Calogero Minacore, the son of an Italian couple, Giuseppe Minacore and Luigia Farruggio. The record showed the child was born in Tunis on February 6, 1910. As a part of his fight against deportation, Marcello has a suit pending in Italy, in which he seeks to have himself declared not a citizen of Italy, in view of his birth in Tunis. As a result of this litigation, the Italian government has refused to issue him a passport for that country. Several weeks ago, the Immigration Service said a foreign informant of the service, not identified, reported on a similar birth record in Guatemala. An investigation showed that on February 6, 1910, an Italian named Giuseppe Minacore informed the registrar of the town of San Jose Pinula of the birth that day in the village of Palo Blanco of a son, whose name was given as Calogero. The mother's name was given as Luigia Farrugia. A few weeks after Carlos Marcello's deportation, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion debacle further intensified the Mafia's unease signaling the beginning of their downfall. The Kennedys' aggressive stance against organized crime and corrupt officials sent shockwaves through the underworld. J. Edgar Hoover himself, confronted with the revelations brought forth by Apalachin in 1963, was compelled to act. In 1960, Luciano was in Italy. He too felt the tremors of change, realizing that time was running out for the Mafia's unchecked reign. Despite demanding a fair share from his men, the escalating tensions on American soil signaled imminent confrontation. The deportation of Marcello prompted mobsters like Russell Bufalino to anticipate their own exile, highlighting the shifting landscape. Within 2 years, tragedy struck with President Kennedy's assassination, leaving Robert to grapple with remorse over his brother's fate. A week after the article was published, a follow-up piece emerged, detailing Marcello's activities in Guatemala. Marcello was livid and outraged by what had happened to him and the impact it had on his family back home. Underworld kingpin Carlos Marcello, deported to Guatemala without warning, today denied he ever obtained citizenship papers from that country. Marcello, who was kidnapped, was silent on the plane ride to Guatemala. "The only time they spoke to me was to ask if I wanted a cup of coffee," he said. Philip Smith, a Marcello attorney, was hustled in the same car that drove Marcello to the airport. Marcello said officials turned the sirens on. "You would have thought it was the president coming in instead of me going out," he said. Guatemala, in accepting Marcello, demanded officials kick him out. Marcello remained in his hotel, awaiting the arrival of his chief attorney, Jack Wasserman, who was reported to be due in from Washington tonight or tomorrow. Marcello Deniez having Guatemalan citizenship. A States Item dispatch from Guatemala City quoted the 51-year-old New Orleans rackets boss as saying his deportation was a kidnapping. Marcello has battled deportation for 9 years. The government previously contended Marcello was born in Tunis. In an interview with States Item reporter Emile Comar, Marcello denied he got Guatemalan citizenship papers to flee there in case his deportation elsewhere appeared imminent. "That's what it was, a kidnapping," he said. "They really kidnapped me. They are the best kidnappers in the world." Marcello, lounging in a luxurious hotel room with his brother who flew from New Orleans to be with him, said immigration agents were silent on the plane ride to Guatemala. "The only time they spoke to me was to ask if I wanted a cup of coffee," he said. Philip Smith, a Marcello attorney, was hustled in the same car that drove Marcello to the airport. Marcello said officials turned the sirens on. "You would have thought it was the president coming in instead of me going out," he said. Several newspapers questioned the validity of his Guatemalan birth record. The certificate, which shows his name to be Calogero Minacor, appears in the civil registry of San Jose Pinula, 10 miles from Guatemala City. The newspaper Prensa Libre said the ink and handwriting of the June 2, 1910, Minacor entry was different than others. Marcello said he could have stopped his deportation if immigration agents gave him a delay of 30 minutes to an hour before spiriting him out of New Orleans. The forthcoming magazine articles promised to unveil more about the tumultuous times and the relentless tide turning against the Mafia and their cohorts in corruption. As my channel grows, the narrative journeys through the concluding chapters of Costello's documentary, Benjamin Siegel's story, and the saga of Meyer Lansky. Transitioning to New York's history with Carlo Gambino sets the stage for delving into Chicago's underworld, led by Paul Rieker, Tony Accardo, and Sam Giancana. The Chicago outfit's influence, akin to the KGB of the Mafia, permeated Hollywood and political circles, intertwining with elite celebrities and presidential affairs. Exploring the relationships between figures like Marilyn Monroe, John F. Kennedy, and Sam Giancana, as chronicled in Judith Exner's My Story, promises to uncover the depth of secrets wielded by the Chicago outfit. Understanding this intricate web of influence is crucial to comprehending the events leading to Carlos Marcello's alleged involvement in the assassination. As the saga unfolds, the shadowy world of organized crime reveals its profound impact on American history. As we conclude our exploration of Chicago's underworld, our narrative will shift to Florida, where we'll unravel the intricate history of the Santo Trafficante crime family. Delving into the Trafficante family's rise to prominence, we'll uncover how they became one of the most formidable and ruthless mafias in American history, wielding influence across the nation. Following our examination of Florida's underworld, we will turn our attention to the pinnacle of power in the American Mafia. Carlos Marcello, the enigmatic figure often referred to as the Godfather of the United States. Marcello, shaped in part by the influence of figures like Costello, reigned as the undisputed boss of Louisiana for over 5 decades. His ruthless demeanor and unwavering control earned him the title of Don of all Dons and King of all Kings within the Italian organized crime structure. As we delve into Marcello's reign, we will confront the apex of organized crime and explore the factors contributing to its eventual downfall. Through Marcello's story, we will unravel the complex dynamics and intricate alliances that defined the underworld landscape. From the heights of power to the depths of corruption, Marcello's tale will serve as the culmination of our journey, shedding light on the fall of organized crime in America. Thank you for your attentive listenership as we unravel the secrets and shadows of America's underworld, culminating in the compelling saga of Carlos Marcello and the demise of organized crime.